Um, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here among all of you and this like-minded community that you're building. It's really incredible and inspiring. So I feel very lucky to be able to be here tonight and chat with you all a little bit. Um, as Sonali mentioned, yeah, my background is a little bit seemingly unconventional, I think, for a current scientist. I'm a science writer, though generally a writer. But as Sonali mentioned, that does kind of inform what I'm interested in terms of how our dogs communicate with us and kind of how they can tell us or be a mirror perhaps to humans in terms of our evolution and how we became such linguistically dependent creatures. So this may be a little bit different from usual, I'm not sure, because there's a lot of overlap with kind of human evolution and the co-evolution of humans and dogs. So there will be some points probably where you're like, this isn't about dogs, but it is, I promise. Oh yeah, and I should mention I am currently doing my research at the George Washington University here in DC, and we'll talk more about that project as we go on, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's see here. All right. Are you all able to see that okay? Great. I'm getting a nod from
Yes, we do.
Awesome. Okay.
Yep.
So again, welcome and thank you. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of faces for dogs communication. And then we'll discuss, like I said, the project that seeks to kind of explore the relationship between physical and behavioral phenotypes in dogs. That is, what dogs look like and how they act, especially when communicating with humans via nonverbal facial cues. So to kind of back things up a little bit, we need to look at the history of our relationship and how dogs came to be communicating with us to begin with. They, as most of you probably know, they're the first animals to be domesticated by humans, and they're the only large carnivore. There are several competing theories as to where, when, and how. A colleague of mine recently, a new paper came out, and he tweeted the other day, guess I have to redo those slides again. It's just kind of always, as we learn more, we're learning more about, how the process of domestication happened. But in general, we have evidence of the presence of dogs in human camps dating back to at least around 25,000 years ago. And there are some skulls of what we call perhaps proto-dogs found in modern day Czech Republic that date to about 27,000 years ago. And then some even to around 30, but they're in the same areas where large quantities of mammoth bone have also been preserved. So we know that those were kind of hunting and eating sites, or at least campsites where, early humans were bringing back kill from the hunt along with these dogs. And I love this image here on the left. This is what we believe to be perhaps a ritual burial of an early dog around 30,000 years ago, with a mammoth bone tucked into its mouth, suggesting that perhaps, there was he was being sent into the afterlife with something to eat with him. So there's evidence of symbolic behavior that early on, and kind of links to that bond that we have with dogs today that persists. And then 10, 12, 15,000 years ago, we start domesticating horses, sheep, goats, a bunch of other animals. We have the first recorded instance of dogs on leashes in cave drawings found recently in present-day Saudi Arabia from around 8,000 years ago. And I love this imagery because I'm not so sure that they're actual physical leashes, but I think those, the lines that we see there are perhaps, again, symbolic of the tie, the bond between our ancestors and our dog's ancestors. because certainly with dogs around to help us out, we would be a lot more efficient in hunting. And I like to say that we're human because of dogs, and people argue with me, and that's okay. Some of you may be familiar with Pat Shipman's work. She suggests that it's perhaps because Homo sapiens were hanging out with dogs that we were able to outcompete our Neanderthal relatives. We do not see as many dog remains around Neanderthal campsites as we do with humans. So as the climate was changing and resources were becoming scarce during that Ice Age kind of period, the late Pleistocene, we may have had a significant advantage to having dogs around. Certainly, once we figured out how to domesticate dogs, we then figured out other animals. We're riding horses. We're transferring information between populations and groups a lot more efficiently. We're trading. All of these things start to develop. Of course, as I mentioned, they help facilitate more efficient hunts, but also they enable us to then sit down and kind of form more permanent camps, which they would help us by protecting, which caused some dietary shifts where, we start to see the rise of agriculture around 10, 12,000 years ago. And then, of course, our relationships. And this is why we're all here today. Dogs are, taking a real significant place in our families and in our social structures, not just as working animals, but as family members, especially as we see changes in career dynamics, home life dynamics, domestic dynamics, and delayed childbearing. There are a couple of really interesting studies that talk about the amount of money millennials spend on their dogs' healthcare versus their own. And I think that's a little bit telling. But I just love, this is the only meme I include here, but I love it because I think it's really relevant, how it started and how it's going. But in all seriousness, in roughly 30,000 years of dogs hanging around the camp, they've picked up a thing or two. They've undergone several selective breeding events directed by people for tasks and jobs in human societies. Again, as I mentioned, including most recently as companions. But they, in adapting to the social and physical environment of humans, they've really acquired behavioral and anatomical traits that engender successful interaction with us, specifically in regard to communication. So in particular, they make eye contact with humans and use a variety of facial cues to effectively speak to us without words. It's interesting to see too that compared to wolves, for example, wolves communicate better with conspecifics or each other than do dogs. They'll look to humans for help. They'll look to humans for information if presented with impossible task paradigms. And they've really figured out how to pick up pointing and gesture. My dog, who passed away a couple of years ago, knew if I were on the computer and it was the end of the day, he could come and unplug my computer and that would get my attention. And then he would look at me and say, okay, it's time to go. So they've really kind of adapted to understand our modes of communicating. What makes them an ideal model then for investigating the evolution of human sociality and specifically communication? This is what I'm touching on. They're a really unique model to explore in terms of genetics and neural correlates. While typically we look at other primates because they're most closely related to us, they've been traditionally the favored models. But it's important to note that we share nearly nothing in terms of social and environmental factors that would influence genetic expression when it comes to our primate relatives. Whereas dogs, on the other hand, have shared our immediate niche for the entirety of their species existence and most of ours, which is really underscored in their behaviors. And we're seeing that reflected in the explosion of literature in dog science in the past 10 to 15 years. So I think to think about how and why dogs communicate with us in certain ways, we need to think about what are some of the characteristics of humans that they're attending to, right? Because a few features of our species play a major role. So if we're going to begin to define humans by their behavior, we'd start by saying that we're a highly social group-living species, and indeed extensive social networks, degrees of altruism, and overall reduced aggression in humans far surpass those in other species. Now, it's ironic that if any of you are familiar with Game of Thrones, that I have this social network of Game of Thrones characters, because we certainly see a lot of aggression in that show. But also, it just speaks more to the importance of networking and social networking for humans and communicating. Maintaining interpersonal and network relationships are crucial to survival and increased quality of life, especially as we've seen now during this COVID era. We've gone to lengths to really maintain the ways that we can communicate with each other, as you see here in this image. But also there's a dog present, which of course is awesome. So because humans are so primed for high tolerance of other individuals, even those in a quote unquote out group, they're able and even inclined to share information and knowledge with other individuals between groups and generations in an intentional way. And this is kind of the basis of what we call social learning. That is, we learn by watching and being taught. And this conveys a selective advantage for us in terms of a species level increase in cognitive capacities. So, the success of social learning is, of course, dependent on the ability to effectively communicate. So think about, for example, how difficult it would be to learn how to tie your shoes without someone first having explained it to you. And in this case, humans are known for our unique and usually highly efficient mode of communication with the use of complex language, which is a hallmark of our species. And indeed, to date, understanding how and why we alone, and as far as we know, ubiquitously use language largely eludes us. And to use one of my colleagues' expressions, language doesn't fossilize, so we can't, it's harder to trace, but we can begin to chip away at the conundrum by working backwards with non-primary language users who've shared our social environmental niche, aka the dogs. And while they don't produce words, we know that they can indeed comprehend. Some of you may be familiar with Rico and Chaser, the border collies. Chaser was demonstrated to have known over 1,000 different words in the English language. So certainly they're getting something here, right? So if we think about what would have led eventually to language, we're considering some pre-linguistic scenarios for learning and teaching and communicating information, and mimicry and gesture are hugely important. Where did you find that food? Where is the predator located? Over there, behind that rock, in that field way far away. They're coming from behind us, etc. So gesticulating would be helpful, but to get more information, what type of creature, how much food, how large, how far away, how many days ago, we can see how the progression toward language would be advantageous. And a step toward that comes in the face. So early humans and hominins' attention to the face was also really important for identifying individuals as our social networks grew, right? Would have been that crucial component. And rare among mammals, that we do see it a little bit in our dogs, is this white sclera, so the visible whites of the eye in humans, which the cooperative eye hypothesis suggests that it's useful for making gaze following easier. It allows us to see others' intentions and where they're looking a lot easier. And we even have a special area in our brain designated toward processing other human faces. So faces are crucial, and whether or not we're identifying that consciously in our conversations on a daily basis, it's happening. In fact, we mimic each other subconsciously when we're interacting with one another. And a mechanism across cultures and populations, a mechanism for establishing those connections necessary for social learning come in facial cues that are especially reliant on, come in nonverbal cues that are especially reliant on the face. And we know that there are facial behaviors associated with 6 core emotions, again, across cultures: happiness, surprise, sadness, anger, disgust, and fear. And they're not culturally specific. So, anyone from around the world can, with roughly the same accuracy, identify these expressions that we see here. We do know that some of the more complex emotions take experience to learn and brain development to learn. And it's just so as children age, for example, they become better at processing more intense emotions, and we see a similar trend in our dogs as they're learning to process different expressions on our faces. Again, when looking at another human, we have these minute shifts in position that unconsciously mimic the feeling meant to be depicted in the other's expression, and that helps us build empathy. So it allows us to process the emotion in another without actually feeling it ourselves. And some of these pre-linguistic modes of communication may have been co-opted and used for interspecies communication in a way that linguistic communication cannot be. So the significance of the face and facial mimicry in social interactions is not limited to human cultures. Corvids and sheep are known to recognize and remember human faces. Even sun bears, which are typically a solitary species, were recently found to mimic exact expressions of conspecifics or other sun bears when placed in a group setting, which I love. That paper came out in 2019 and it's really a gem. But other social species, including chimps and dogs, utilize analogous systems of universally coded facial expressions with actually some direct human homologs, which we can see here with the chimpanzee. And here we are, we're getting to the dogs, I promise. So dogs, in fact, have not only evolved to process human facial cues, they've developed a propensity for responding in kind. And even humans unfamiliar with dogs, a couple of studies have showed, were able to identify these canine expressions. So this image should look somewhat familiar. These are our 6 core human emotions, and these are meant to be replicated. This is Mal. He's a Malinois, a Belgian Malinois, and I get tongue-tied when I try to say that. And he was a police dog. And the researchers trained her, or used various stimuli such as treats, novel items, medication, and nail clippers. They were presented to him to elicit different reactions, and then they would take his pictures. So the medicine, for example, he didn't like the smell of it or the taste of it, and so that was to elicit the disgust face. Or the nail clippers. Obviously, not you all, but many of you have probably experienced the run and hide game when you bring out the nail clippers that our dogs like to do. So it was really interesting to think about the ways in which they got Mal to make the expressions that he did. I would guess that most of you could probably identify most of what's going on here. This study included, experts, non-experts, or experts who kind of ranked people who were familiar with dogs, that is, they had trained their dog in something at some point along the way, and then non-experts who were not familiar at all. And while experts were in general concurrence, even they had some difficulty distinguishing neutral from happy. So it's really interesting to think about how dogs have become more, they've become better at reading our faces than we are at theirs. We can identify a lot, but we still have some challenges with the nuance, right? So neutral and happy were difficult for most of the groups, as were sadness and fear, which if you think about it, we think about the whale eye in our dogs and the ears back and down. And those emotions seem to be portrayed similarly on a dog's face. Interestingly, with this study, and maybe counterintuitively, those with no experience with dogs were better able to classify a dog angry face, which may suggest that that's kind of more of a basal reaction to threat. Just in terms of an animal, right? We tend to think of our dogs as not scary or not aggressive. And someone who didn't have experience with them in the way that others do would maybe be cued more into what an aggressive looks like. But we also know that there's this beautiful kind of mutual gaze behavior going on in humans. So human-like modes of communication, including mutual gaze, in dogs have been acquired during domestication. Some of you may be familiar with oxytocin. It's a hormone most famously implicated in maternal bonding during breastfeeding with an infant, sometimes also known as, quote, the love hormone in humans. It's also implicated in monogamous pair bonding. And we show that in the study from Nakasawa and his colleagues in 2015, and there have been subsequent ones since, that gazing behavior, so again, looking straight in the eyes, from dogs, but not wolves, because again, if we're thinking about, sorry, Sonder, can we not speak right now? Good boy. Toys. If we think about wolves, direct eye contact in most other animal species is an agonistic behavior, right? So it's a threat, it's a challenge. So it's unique that dogs have developed this behavior. And we show that gazing behavior from dogs, but not wolves, increased urinary oxytocin levels in owners, which consequently facilitated owners' affiliation and attachment and increased the oxytocin concentration in dogs. And then a step further, nasally administered oxytocin, so sniffed, in dogs increased gazing behavior in dogs, which then increased the oxytocin urinary concentration in humans. So all of that is to say, we have this, oxytocin feedback loop of love going on when we are looking at our dogs and they're looking at us, modulated by this gaze behavior. Human dog bonding becomes a crucial part of the communication and social attachment. I'll stop rambling about that. Notably, while dog brains do not have specific human face or dog face preferring regions in the way human brains do, they do exhibit temporal cortex activation, which is part of the visual pathway implicated in face processing in humans and other species. They do exhibit activation in those areas. The two actually adjacent areas, one for human faces and one for dog faces, which I think is very interesting. And they are also remarkably adept at recognizing human emotional cues displayed in the face. So if we look at this figure over here, on the left, the hot areas show, the hot colors show visual cortex activation, and the cool areas show face-specific activation overlaid onto those already identified areas. And then in this study on the right, it's a test of lab dogs versus pet dogs in an eye tracking machine. And by lab dogs, we mean dogs living at the dog lab in Vienna, so not, like horribly treated beagles in a science lab, but just those living not in households with families. So their levels of communication and human-directed communication would be different from day to day. And those who were primarily family dogs were better at identifying the emotional valence in pictures presented of human faces. Furthermore, a study from a couple of years ago by Julianne Kaminsky and her team demonstrate that the quantity and variety of facial expressions produced by domestic dogs increase in response to attentive humans versus non-attentive, with attention here defined just simply as facing the dog or with your back turned to the dog. And they looked at with or without food to make sure that wasn't a factor. And they found that, so an increased number and types of expressions. We see here the famous eyebrow raise here was one of the most popular. And this graph just shows the frequency of that with attention versus not attention. They use this really great system called the Dog Facts, the facial action coding system, which is based on, there's a human facts that's used in psychological and sociological research for a long time, and it's modeled after that. It's dependent on, it identifies observable facial changes associated with underlying muscle movements measured by action units to allow for non-emotional or anthropomorphized interpretations of expression. Again, they saw that, those particular eye movements of the upper eyebrow area and some toward the ears were shown with most frequency. So we've established that faces are significant to both humans and social primates for identification, and perhaps more importantly for communication, and so too then in dogs due to social coevolution. In primates, we have this interesting example shown by Santana and her team a couple of years ago, that facial color patterns are linked to social factors, such that the more social the primate, essentially, the more coloration and complex patterns we see on their faces. And again, this is going to help to ID individuals in a large group setting, which also avoids interbreeding, but may really help to exaggerate certain expressions, such as, for example, a colored eyebrow region enhancing a raised brow, or red cheeks enhancing a cheek puff during a communicative event. And this phylogeny just shows that warmer colors are more complex. On the phylogenetic tree, the warmer lines are more complex variations of patterns. Right, so moving on. However, within these various social primate taxa, including humans, additional research from Santana and her team shows that coloration has its limitations. So as the species' capacity for complex facial expressions increases, there's a trade-off. In order for those expressions to be clearly communicated, too much patterning or too many colors could actually be detrimental if it occludes the gesture that is meant to be made at the muscular level. So we can see, especially as we move toward larger brain here with gorilla, chimpanzee, and humans, these highly gregarious, highly social species capable of more complex expressions, faces become much plainer until we arrive at humans, where we're real boring. We're just like straight plain face. We've got like some eyebrows if we're lucky, coloration in the lips, and not much beyond that. So what about dogs? Concurrently with the study of attention, Annie Burrows and her team investigated whether or not the production of those expressions in dogs is linked to changes in facial musculature over time in the way that we see in primates, as determined by comparison of facial muscles between wolves and dogs. And according to Burrows, gross results revealed that the dog and the wolf samples were similar to one another, in all facial musculature except for two, the levator and the retractor around the eye, which would be primarily responsible again for those like eye raising and kind of what we call puppy dog eyes that we see a lot of in the Kaminsky study. And some of you have, I'm sure, seen or read about this. But questions remain as to whether or not this potential anatomic anomaly is the result of domestication and centuries worth of human-directed communication, or something else, given that intentional breeding has produced a broad range of relative eye muscle sizes in domesticated dogs. Especially, it's possible that other factors are at play, including neuronal signaling to the muscles in question, and potentially surface level facial pigmentation related to domestication. Indeed, my own research from my master's study, I investigated facial muscles in several different canid and vulpine species and found that the muscles in question were present, if not necessarily as robust as in dogs every time. So that makes me think there might be something else going on besides this communicative hypothesis. Which brings me to my study and what I'm looking at and what I would love for you all to participate in. So perhaps instead of the underlying muscles, something on the surface of dogs' faces is coming into play when they're communicating with us. Since domesticated dogs and non-human primates show this striking convergent evolution in terms of facial patterns and ornamentation, research here could be mutually informative, both dogs and humans. So what I'm seeking to investigate is through behavioral and physical phenotype analyses, looking at facial expressions and physical features combined. Do dogs living in households with humans of dogs living in households with humans, what is the potential impact of markings and pigmentation on the expressions they make toward us? And you can see here, I just love this image of all of our different, very diverse dog faces. So the project is what is written on a dog's face, and I'm not going to click on this, but it just goes to the website. It's howdogstalk.org, and I can throw that in the chat later. And the first step to addressing this is to recruit canine subjects, and to maximize the number of participants and to help everyone engage in citizen science. I have a video protocol or an at-home protocol that everyone can participate with. I can send it to you when you sign up. And it's essentially taking a series of 4 short videos of your dog's face. This is kind of what it looks like. You would reach out, sign a consent form. I give you information and I send the protocol. And there are 4 filming conditions, and these are meant to elicit the various range of response that a dog may have. So we're going to take a still image of the face to get what they look like phenotypically, physical phenotypically. And then 4 conditions: 1, at rest with no eye contact; 2, with eye contact but no speaking; 3, with eye contact while saying words unfamiliar to the dog; and 4, eye contact using familiar words. And it's been really interesting so far to see what that range looks like. You know, intuitively, we think that, oh, when you're talking to your dog and saying something like, "Would you like to go to the park? Let's go to the park. Would you like a treat?" etc. They know these words and they're tending to you. And that's certainly the case. But I've found also that if in many of our subjects, when their dog parents are just staring at them without saying anything, they get very confused. And so they're making a lot of expressions in response to try to figure out, okay, what does human want from me right now? What am I supposed to be doing? How am I supposed to be reacting? And so they seem to be displaying, and maybe even a higher rate than in the familiar word condition. That's TBD. I'll let you know when I have results. But I will be evaluating their expressions using that same system that I was telling you about, the Dog Facts, as well as Deep Lab Cut, which is a morphometric software package that tracks animal poses through underlying muscle movements, which is really cool. And these are just some of examples of some of the action units we might see recorded in the in the behavioral videos. And then for the physical phenotypes, I have a matrix of markings and coloration. We do know a little bit about the genes implicated in pigmentation for dog coat colors, but unfortunately I won't have the genetic information from all of my subjects to look at that. So I'm using those to create just an estimate of, okay, what again is the spectrum of variation of color that we can see in dogs, and evaluating those will look something like this. This is Odin. He was one of my participants and he was great. So using the colors and the most prominent marking patterns identified from, roughly 200 AKC recognized breeds, the matrix assigns a complexity score to each individual's face. And then that complexity score gets matched with the rate of facial expression from the behavior. And that's when we'll be evaluating to see if there's anything going on here. I'm going to wrap up shortly. I know we want to leave time for a Q&A. But just there's why do this? For me, part of it comes from understanding a piece of the puzzle of language and communication. It aims to contribute to this conversation by investigating whether or not human-directed breeding has influenced expression, or if there's an overall effect of social living and communication that withstands genetic manipulation. It's also just a really awesome chance to evaluate interspecies interactions. We don't get that opportunity a lot. And it will help to think about whether interspecies communication rather than conspecific communication like dog on dog impacts the production of expressions, or if just kind of any highly social environment is a sufficient selective pressure. And of course, it thinks about bigger questions of pro-sociality. And you may be familiar with this self-domestication theory in humans, whereby it's survival of the nicest. But that's another conversation. And of course, again, the broader impacts and the things that are most important to me here are thinking about the health and safety of our working dogs, practices for service and therapy dogs, informing welfare decisions and policies, encouraging better shelter animal outcomes. If we know how our dogs are communicating with us, the more we know about how they're communicating with us, the better guardians we can be to them. I'm sure most of you are aware that most dogs in the world aren't treated the way ours are. In fact, most dogs aren't domesticated. 80% of the dogs are not, of domesticated dogs, are not living in households. So we can really be better guardians and better partners in evolution, the more we know about what and how they're trying to say to us. And then, of course, getting this opportunity for all of us to engage in citizen science. And I will stop there. And I'm happy to talk. I just talked at you for a long time.
Thanks so much, Courtney. So if folks, you have questions, you can drop them in the chat and I can call on you to, or if you would like, feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in, because we have about 12 minutes. So maybe that's a more optimal way to operate tonight. So if you have a question, feel free to jump in. Courtney, I have a few questions. I can jump in with mine while people are still pondering theirs. So it sounds like the study of dog faces is actually pretty early. This is one of the earlier studies. I'm curious, we seem to be studying dogs in the context of human interactions. And in the past, we've looked at, human and primate interactions. So when you were conducting these sorts of studies, do you primarily look at like the human component, or do you also look at their closest relatives, which are wolves? I know there was one study in there, but I'm just curious how you decide those parameters of whom do you contrast or compare with, I guess.
Yeah, so for me at the stage that I'm at in terms of this will be my dissertation project. I'm limited by a lot of things. So you kind of have to think, okay, what are some of the questions I can actually answer? And so I'm looking directly at, I won't be doing a formal comparison with wolves, partially because, again, wolves just don't communicate with humans the way dogs do. So that they're not really the best outgroup, even wolves that are habituated to humans. I am informally going to look at a group, but I don't know how much that will influence what I end up understanding about this particular study. On the flip side, I'm also not looking at specifically the way humans are interacting, like their human faces are not showing up anywhere on the video. So I'm not tracking that side of it. What I am tracking is their perceptions. So one of the things I'm interested to find out is everyone who participates fills out a short survey about how expressive they think their dog is or how much they think they communicate with their dog. And so it'll be really interesting to see how good of a judge we are compared to what the dog's actual score is. And I think that'll be a little bit telling.
Yeah, definitely. Great. So we do have some questions coming in. So Dylan wants to know, is there value or alternative means of participating in the study if your dog is hard of hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm definitely going to be looking across both. I kind of cut this part out, but I'm going to be looking across and within breeds and a variety of other factors. So kind of, how much is this a working dog? Is it primarily a pet dog? What level of experience with different human signaling have they had? So it could certainly be adapted for a hard of hearing dog. The verbal component isn't something I'm looking specifically at. That's just, again, to elicit that range of expressions from the dog. So if there are other ways that a person typically communicates with a hard of hearing dog, we could adapt it for that.
Very cool. Sounds like Oliver can participate, Dylan.
Yeah.
So we have a question.
Thank you.
We have a question from Noelle. She wants to know if this research explains the bias away from Black dogs in shelters as being less adoptable, because Black dogs' faces are very difficult to decipher.
Yeah, so we'll find out if that's actually true or not. If they follow the trend that we see in primates, a solid face of any color should typically be more behaviorally or muscularly expressive. But we don't know, so we'll find out. It could help that for sure.
Very cool. We have a question from Louise. Do dogs with bulging eyes, like Cavaliers, have more effective emoting abilities?
I'm not going to say like across the board yes or no. We may be more attuned to their eyes as humans because we're used to looking at them. But again, we'll find out by using this kind of non-anthropomorphized system, we'll find out if that actually is the case or not. Are they making more expressions? Are they making more robust expressions? Or does it just look that way to us? Which is also an important thing to think about. Whether or not it's happening, it's how we're perceiving it too, right? So that can be a selective advantage at the end of the day, regardless.
Our next question is from Nina. She wants to know, what is the impact of floof? Some dogs, you can barely see their facial expressions.
Yes. So one of the challenges is in our interesting breeding choices over the years. So we have some dogs' faces that are less visible. Some folks who have participated have trimmed back the hair that falls over the eyes specifically before participating, but that would certainly impact. You would think it might hide expressions, although if you have something, for example, like hanging off of the brow region and you lift your brow, that's going to move really visibly, right? So you may actually see more of the movement than you would otherwise.
Very
I have
cool.
lots of videos to watch, so I will let you know.
We have a question from Casey. Hi, Casey. Glad you joined. She said, I have seen a select number of dogs that will smile or grimace when happy. Have you seen this and what do you think of it? And she just goes on to describe a little further, as in they will draw their lips back so their teeth are visible, but their ears and body are relaxed and the tail is wagging.
Yeah, I'm definitely familiar. They retract their lips, and lots of times that underlying muscle movement is one that we see in more aggressive facial actions. But it's certainly not one, because if you're thinking about the context of the situation and the rest of the body clues and cues as you are, they're very clearly not feeling aggressive or threatened in any way. My brother's late dog, Ember, was the biggest smiler I ever met. And I don't know much about the origin of that particular expression. It may have something to do originally with submission in some ways, because that retraction does have a little bit of, it is implicated a little bit in submissive behavior too. So I'm not sure. I don't want to give wrong information, but that's a guess.
We have a question from Sunny. Do dogs have a resting face like humans do? I want to say my dog does the puffy face by default rather than by emotion. And if you saw a picture of Cody, you would see what she means. He's adorable.
Well, this is something that it's actually a really popular theory that as dogs were being domesticated, so a lot of things are happening in terms of the change in their skull structure, their face structure, their snout structure, compared to so I just want to clarify for everyone in case you don't already know, extant wolves, or wolves that are alive today, are not the same animals that are domesticated dogs' relatives. They share a common ancestor of a wolf-like animal that is no longer around. Where was I going with that? Anyway, oh yes, in the process of coming from that ancestor to dog, you may be familiar with some of the traits in the domestication syndrome. So like the ears start to fall off. You have overall reduced aggression that is tied to these physical changes too. We have floppier ears, floppier tails, not solid coat coloration, shorter noses, overall gracility or less robust face and bone structure. And we see this across domesticated animals. They are what we call neotenized, or look perpetually childlike or infant-like or puppy-like. So part of being a dog is looking like a baby all the time, or looking like a puppy all the time, compared to a wolf or a wild type relative. And in some, because of the way we've bred them, some of those features are more or less exaggerated, and so they may certainly, their resting face may always look very puppyish, which would be appealing, right, to our nourishing instincts. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So we have a question from Lysuna. Lysuna, I'm just going to let you unmute yourself. Lysuna is our resident dog scientist at Petminded. So Lysuna, don't be shy. Go ahead.
Summer, I wanted to hear you pronounce those words. So I'm actually I'm kind of curious as to if you are looking at head shape, or I guess like how you would look at head shape as it relates to the dog's ability to actually like make these expressions. So like if you have a brachiocephalic dog, so those are all like your snub-nosed dogs, to your juliocephalic dogs, so those are your long-nosed dogs. Like if that skull shape would affect their ability to, like if one of like if a juliocephalic dog would have the ability to make like a wider range of expressions just because of like their bone structure. So I guess more so the bone structure of like their head and how that like would affect their facial expressions or ability to make them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not going to be looking at any cranial morphologies, although some studies, some eye tracking studies have showed that definitely the facial bone structure affects even their their ability to identify different emotions because of, where their eyes are located in the socket. They may not be able to match to an expression in the same way, especially with, as you mentioned, some of the brachycephalic dogs. So I'm sure it does affect it. I just don't have the capacity to include that in this study.
There's like really cool MRI stuff going on like around the country, and that's like that's how they like look at it. It would be really cool if like some of the participants could like get MRI scans, but like there's a whole training protocol with that that's like pretty intense. But that'd be pretty cool to like look at in conjunction with your study and just see how like that all matches up.
It would be awesome. I'm actually, some of the folks I'm collaborating with up in Boston are working on some of the MRI work. And I would love as kind of a next step to be able to do something like that for sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much for.
Hey, Sonali, if it's, can I ask one question?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, promise it won't be long. I don't think. Courtney, this has been awesome. Super insightful. I just had a question. Are you like taking body language into any of this, or is the main study just to like figure out, can dogs recognize facial expressions? Like, because I always, when we take our dog for a walk, we see other dogs like they bow down. They are like so expressive with everything other than their face.
Yeah, so this particular study is strictly face, again, modeled off of the primate work to kind of see how the trends do or don't correlate. But some of the outreach I've been working on is definitely to try to just talk to people about looking at the whole dog when they're communicating. And not only that, but the context, right? Because even, I hear this a million times a day. Oh, they're wagging their tails, they're happy. And as we all here know, there are many different kinds of tail wags. But even those different kinds of tail wags can mean something different in different contexts. Is it a stranger, a familiar person, a strange dog, a familiar dog? Is it a dyad, or are there multiple? Is there some perceived threat that we don't know of? So you really have to take in so many factors when you're thinking about body language overall.
Great. I think that's a great question to end on. Thank you for asking that, Andy. And by the way, there is a great book called Doggy Language by Lily Chin. She came to speak about 4 months ago, and that was a fabulous talk where she has done all these great illustrations. And you can see it's a great way to understand dog body language. So if you're at all interested, I don't get a kickback. I just love her. I think she does amazing work. I would check that out. But Courtney, thank you so much. This was so interesting. I feel we're really lucky to see sort of, this is the beginning of this new sort of topic in dog cognition. And we're really fortunate to have sort of a sneak peek into how you're thinking about it, what questions you're asking. So thank you for walking us through that process. And really excited to see the results. No pressure.
Yeah, no.
But
for listening to me ramble for 40 minutes.
Yeah, I can't wait to have you come back and tell us what you discovered. And for folks who want to participate in Courtney's study, I know someone was looking for a link. I will put that in the follow-up email that you will receive from Petminded, so you'll have that. And yeah, I'll include all of Courtney's information so you can sign up for the study and follow them on Instagram, because I think that's where they're recruiting participants right now as well. So thanks everyone for coming. Hope to see you at another Petminded event, and have a good night. Thanks. Bye.
Wow, so great to meet you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Buddy.
Oh no, we didn't get to meet Sonder.
Here, he's been chewing multiple things.
He wanted to meet everyone, and we. Oh, poor baby. Oh, I feel bad.
He got lots of dog park time today.